Hello, thank you so much for joining me today for this presentation on documentation. My name is Tammy Middleton and I work for iCrimp as a HR risk manager. So my main focus today will be about documenting employee interactions, and I want to make the main focus on avoiding mistakes that get us into trouble when we're trying to defend our position or our decisions regarding those employee interactions. So I created this training because one of the biggest frustrations I hear about is the inability to move forward with disciplinary actions or a termination on an employee due to the lack of really good supportive documentation. So just a quick note on what type of employment files you should have. The basic 3 files that I think everyone should have for each employee is a personnel file, a legal payroll file, and a medical file. So I'm not going to get too far into types of employment files, but these 3 files are the basics I like to see for all employees. A personnel file should contain basic documents like your hiring documents. Those would include an application, a resume, any employee reviews that you complete, disciplinary actions, any types of rewards and recognition, coaching logs, attendance. I also recommend having a log of any trainings that you complete for that employee and a new hire checklist. That's just usually a list of all the new hire documents and processes that you complete for each employee as they enter your business. And then a legal and payroll file. In that file are documents like W-4s, any garnishments, or tax documents. And those are usually maintained and kept by the payroll person. And then a medical file. Medical files should contain documents on FMLA or ADA requests and doctor's notes if you have those. It's really important to make sure that if you require your employee to provide doctor's notes, which I do not recommend, but that's a conversation for another day. But if you do collect or keep doctor's notes from your employees for attendance reasons, it's really important that those are not contained in their employment file, because occasionally we do look at employment files when we're reviewing employees or discussing employment actions, and that's not information that we would necessarily want somebody to have when considering disciplinary action and other things. So those should be separate. And also just a reminder, all employment files are subject to your organization's record retention policy, so you need to ensure that you have a record retention policy and that you're aware of what that policy is. Also, access to these types of files should be very limited. No one outside of HR should have access to employment files, and if you don't have a policy on that, you can certainly refer to iCrimp's sample policy on information on access to these, and make sure that you know who should have access to employment files and under what circumstance to give access to those files. So moving forward, let's talk about the value of documentation. We talk about the importance of documentation, but it's frequently one of those things that we don't spend a lot of time on, or we don't put a lot of effort into, or frequently will get pushed to the back burner, and so it doesn't happen in a very timely manner or very well, if at all. These are one of my favorite sayings when it comes to documentation. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen, and I'm sure that all of you have heard that a lot. And another one that I really like is incorrect documentation is often worse than no documentation. And what that really comes down to is when we document things incorrectly or incompletely, it can sometimes hurt us more than not having documentation at all. At the end of the day, we use documentation a lot in court cases or when we're sued by our employees. And so just because you haven't been sued doesn't mean that you won't be sued. The truth of the matter is that none of us ever hire an employee that we think will sue us. We always hire our very best candidate, and we never expect to be sued. But it does happen, and a lot of us are just one lawsuit away from learning our lesson on how important documentation is in the employment process and in the employment relationship. For me, I always prepare like I'm going to court. From the very first day when I hire an employee or when I start an employee relationship, I always prepare like I'm going to court. From that very first application document through retirement, I document the entire time as if that employment relationship may go the wrong way and I may have to go to court. So as a supervisor or a leader in your organization, how does documentation benefit you? First and foremost, it provides you as a supervisor or leader in your organization as a record. So it lets you know what you've done before. It helps support conversations that you're having now by letting you refer to what you've had in the past. So you know if you've had an attendance conversation with this employee 2 or 3 times, you know when you had that conversation, you know what your employee committed to. Historically, if they gave you assurances that they understood the rules or they understood the training you've provided to them. So it allows you to not let that employee backslide or argue with you about whether or not they understood what the rules were or the policy was. So it really helps you hold them accountable. It provides future supervisors with a record of what conversations you've had. So if you move on in your organization to another role, or if that employee moves on to another department or another supervisor or another role, it allows anybody supervising them in the future to know what that employee has been held accountable to in the past, so that every time they go somewhere else or have a different situation in your organization, they don't get to hit the restart button and we don't keep restarting with them all the time so they continue to have bad behaviors. Also, an important thing to know is that documentation belongs to your employer. It is the property, if you will, of your organization or agency. And as such, it is what helps your organization be protected long-term from actions of the employee. From the employee standpoint, when employees know that their supervisor does document, good or bad, their behaviors, they understand that their supervisor notices what they're doing, that their performance matters, and they will be more mindful of their conduct. Also, writing it down helps solidify the information. So when you have new supervisors in your organization, the process of documenting will help provide them with the confidence they need when they're making decisions, so they know they'll have that information to build on. And for employees, it also helps create some accountability. No employee should be surprised when they're terminated. If that's the direction we need to go, they shouldn't be surprised by that. And when they know that you're documenting and you're having these conversations and those conversations are documented, they should not be surprised by any action you're taking. And when employees are not surprised, they are less likely to swing back at the organization. They're less likely to sue because they knew it was coming, they know what's expected. And that's the place that we want to get to. So how does documenting benefit your organization? So always when we're talking about employee actions and making sure that we're protecting our organization, it's important to know that courts like documentation. Good documentation at the time of a conversation is much stronger than testimony alone. Agencies like documentation. So EEOC, they like documentation about the conversations, interactions, and trainings that you've had with your employees. The Department of Labor likes documentation. Idaho Human Rights Commission, workers' compensation, unemployment, they all like documentation. They always like to be able to answer questions like, well, how have you trained your employee? What kind of conversations did you have with them? Did your employee understand what was expected of them? Were they given an opportunity to correct their behavior? And believe it or not, they will not take your word for it. They want to see documentation. They want to know. And just because you're a supervisor or you have a job title like supervisor or manager or commissioner or mayor, they won't necessarily take your word for it against an employee. They want to see that documentation. So it's really important that we keep track of the conversations that we're having and that we're able to provide that. So let's talk about the mistakes that we make with documentation that hurt us in the future. So we're frequently unable to defend our actions, not because we don't have good cause, but because we have poor documentation. There are so many times when I look at documentation and I listen to the story and I know we have a bad actor, a bad employee who really should be terminated or really should be disciplined, but we just aren't able to really take that action and be able to defend it because our documentation just does not support the action that we want to take. So here's some of the basics. Documentation that is unsigned, undated, or illegible. So for example, here's some signatures. If I'm looking at this documentation 2 or 3, 4, 5 years down the road, I can't tell who signed this, and maybe the supervisor doesn't work here anymore. I don't know whose signature that is, and so I'm unable to call that person as a witness, or I'm unable to have a conversation to clarify something. If I see a date that is 6/12, I don't know if that's June 12th or June 2020 or June 2012. So those types of things are really important at the time of the document is created to make sure that we're putting the complete date, that we're writing the name underneath the signature so we know who's there. Remember that really often the document that you're creating regarding the situation with the employee will not make an appearance in court until years after it's written. So it really needs to be able to stand on its own in case the person who wrote it is no longer with your organization. So here's another mistake that we struggle with. Documents that are created after the fact. So documenting a July incident in October. Many questions will come up around this. So documentation that's created at the time of the incident is usually accepted as genuine. The longer the time from the incident to the documentation, the less genuine it will appear. So if there's 3 months between when the incident happened and when it's documented, all kinds of questions come up. So how will I trust your details? So for example, if I asked you what you had for lunch 3 months ago on a Thursday, would you be able to tell me? Probably not. So how will I trust that 3 months later you have the details right about an incident? I will ask questions like, why is it important now? So it wasn't important enough 3 months ago for you to document it, so why is it important now? And that brings into play all sorts of other questions. So are you retaliating? It wasn't important 3 months ago, but you're writing it up now. So maybe this is a retaliation issue. Or maybe you are discriminating against an employee now. So it's really, really important that things are timely so that we don't bring all these other questions into play. Another thing that we want to make sure of is if you were not doing the documentation if you do end up, for whatever reason, writing documentation in October, it's really important that you don't backdate it for July. So you don't want to write the documentation in October and backdate it for July as if you wrote it in July. Because if you get caught doing that, that's kind of falsifying the document. It's not a true document, and then everything you wrote in that document would be questioned, and your integrity. So then all the other documents that you write would not necessarily be trusted. So backdating is a big no-no for documents that may later be examined. And then also date ranges. This is something is when we create documents after the fact, and then we're not sure what day we had them. So it's like sometime in January this happened, or sometime in February this happened. When we put a date range on a document, it's really almost worse than not having a document at all, because we don't really know when we had that conversation, and so it's really hard. Then I'm questioning you. Did you even have the conversation, or do you think you had the conversation? It wasn't important enough for you to even remember when you had it. So that can sometimes be problematic when we're trying to talk about employee disciplinary issues. Another thing is unprofessional documents. So the less professional your document looks, the less impact it will have. So if your documentation has a lot of scribbles where we write something down and then we change our mind and we scribble it out, or we write another thing over it, then it looks like we're doing a lot of changing our mind about what we want to say. And that can look very unprofessional. It can look like we're not really sure about what we think about the situation. It's perfectly fine to make yourself notes, but the final document that goes into the employee file should be professionally composed, and it should be accurate and should state the facts, and it should not have a lot of editing like this type of document. Another thing that we don't want to do is have employee documentation on Post-it notes or scraps of paper, things like that are just shoved into the document that don't have signatures, don't have dates, they're not legible. Like I mentioned before, those types of things that just look like, you know, they're kind of afterthoughts and not really conversations that are had with the employee that are on a professional level. And the devil's in the details. So we want to make sure that the documentation that we do present or that we are reviewing for an employee situation, that we are not having a lot of inaccuracies, we're not having copy and paste, employee issues with same names, omissions, wrong files. So let me give you some examples of things that I have seen in files when I've reviewed files for corrective actions or for release under a subpoena. So these are the types of errors that I ran into. So we had a situation, I reviewed a file, I had Todd Smith's review. So I was looking over Todd Smith's review, which was very poor and supported the termination that we were reviewing for. The problem was that we did not have a Todd Smith. We had Todd Jones, the employee in question, and we had a Tom Smith, no Todd Smith. So I'm looking at reviewing for termination, I could not tell whose review it was. Wrong name on it. That employee did not exist in our organization. So this kind of inaccuracy brought into question the entire termination, and we were not able to move forward with the termination because we could not substantiate whose review it actually was. And it was concerning, of course, that the supervisor had brought it forward with a review in the file that clearly couldn't be attached to the employee we were considering. We had a pay complaint, which was brought forward by an employee, and we had a training document, and we had a payroll timesheet document. The training documents had the employee checked off as attending the training, but the time clock showed him as being absent. So we had an inconsistency there between those two documents to determine, you know, if the employee should or should not be paid for the time of day. Those types of issues can come up. And then we had another situation where I had an employee that filed a complaint against the organization for discrimination. And in reviewing the file, getting ready to turn it over for subpoena, I went through and looked at it, found a review document. So the employee had been reviewed, and I was going through the review document. And in that document, one of the comments on her review said, Linda needs to make sure that she puts all the files away and secures them before leaving for the day, which was unfortunate because Susie was being held accountable for something that Linda had done. So clearly the supervisor who had performed that review had copy and pasted something she had written on Linda's review into Susie's review, and that had not been caught in the review process. So when somebody reviewed her review, they had not caught that a copy and paste had happened, and that was in her file. And so that was something that ended up going out with the documents that were subpoenaed. So these types of things can really become a problem when we're looking at documents and employees make complaints, or there's a suit or something comes up, and then we have all these kinds of inaccuracies. And one of the things that becomes problematic is if there are several inconsistencies, it can make the author or the person who may have to testify or who wants to make if you're the supervisor and you're wanting to terminate or discipline an employee, if there's several inconsistencies, it can bring the author's integrity into question. And if there's lots and lots of them, it can make the organization look questionable. So it's really important that documents are accurate, that we review them frequently and make sure that our filing is accuracy, things are in the right place, and that we're catching these types of errors so that we can take the actions that we need to take when we need to take them. So here are some examples of sometimes when we have information, on our documents that are really too vague to be useful. So a lot of times supervisors don't want documentation to sound too harsh. So they try to soften the wording, and unfortunately this can cloud the facts and it can just keep us from being able to use them. And that's not to say that, I recommend supervisors be harsh or mean, but I do want them to, state the facts. So here's an example. Cindy could improve. I'm not entirely sure what this is saying. Does this mean that Cindy is doing a good job, but she could be doing a great job, and so I'm going to, coach her to some things that she could do to move from good to great? Or does this mean that she's not doing good and she needs to improve? And I also don't know what we're talking about as far as what should improve. So here's another one. So I talked to Corey about her behavior. I'm not sure in this statement what the behavior was, and I'm not sure if it was she did something good or she did something bad, and I'm not sure what the outcome is going to be. So if I asked her to change something, or have I gained any sort of commitment. This one is a little bit better. It appears that Dave has not mastered the new process, but I don't know what the new process is, and I don't know what the timeline is, and I'm not really sure what I'm asking him to do or how far behind he is. This would be a better example. So after 3 weeks of training, so now I have a timeline, the rest of the team is using the new process and making few mistakes. So now I have a comparative. Dave made 11 mistakes today and didn't finish his assigned work. A coworker had to rework some of the files he completed. So this gives me a lot more detail in this. So I know how many mistakes he made, I have a comparative, and I also know the impact to the team. Here's another one that I see happen a lot: speculation and unsupported conclusions. Angie was drunk. This is a pretty easy one to jump to. You have an employee come in, you smell their breath, they smell like alcohol, they're behaving a certain sort of way, you know that they're drunk. Unfortunately, as supervisors, unless you are specifically trained, you can't jump to that conclusion in a professional setting. You're simply not qualified to make that statement, but you are qualified to report what you saw. This is a much better statement that you can make, or document that you can substantiate. So when Angie returned from lunch, she appeared disoriented, she stumbled, she slurred her words, had to lean on the desk to maintain her balance, smelled of alcohol. Later, she was found asleep on her desk. So those are all facts. It's very clear. It's a little more spelled out exactly the behavior that you saw, and those things cannot be disputed. Whereas saying Angie was drunk, that could absolutely be disputed, because many of these types of behaviors could be explained by a medical condition, such as trauma. If she had been in a car accident, bumped her head, that sort of thing could be explained away. And they would certainly be able to argue that. Whereas these are just stating the fact, so that would be much better for documentation. Frank is lazy and insubordinate. Those definitely could be solid descriptions. However, they aren't stating any facts. They're a lot more subjective, and so we want to stay away from subjective and really get to the facts. Frank did not complete the annual report. That is a fact by the agreed upon dateline, so that lets me know that Frank and I had a conversation and we agreed on a deadline. When I asked, he stated, "It's not really my job, you're just pawning your work off on me." So that lets me know what his behavior was specifically, rather than just saying he was insubordinate. So that gives a very clear picture of his behavior in relation to the conversation around the deadline. So this is much more solid documentation than just my opinion that he's lazy and insubordinate. And that will be much stronger. So Little white lies and over-documenting. This frequently is a problem when we have very difficult and challenging employees. So these are the really tough ones that just really get under our skin. They constantly find loopholes. They are really make work difficult. They're constantly testing the boundaries. If there's a loophole at work, they're through it, and they just make working environment very, very difficult. It's easy to get into a space with these employees where we start over documenting them because we just want to get every little detail because they're really hard to nail down. It's like trying to herd cats. And so we can get into this space where we start having a bias towards them, and we exaggerate the negative, we can downplay the positives, and because we want to create this desired result. We want to paint a picture of an employee that needs to be fired. And what can happen is we just start over documenting them. So for example, we might be tempted to notate every single time the person is late. So even 1 minute. So they're 1 minute late to work, they're 1 minute late from break, they leave 1 minute early for lunch. We're writing down every single time, and then pretty soon we have 60 occurrences when they've been late. Or we list every time they misspell a word, or we criticize their behavior really harshly. And so we end up in this situation where we have this one employee who's got a file that looks like a phone book full of documentation. Or maybe we have conversations with them and disciplinary action with them where we notate them as always and never. They're always late to work. They're never on time to meetings. They always make mistakes. And that type of thing kind of creates a situation where the employee gets very defensive, and then we get in this cycle with them, and it just keeps building and building. Or we forget to or downplay their positives. So maybe they did hand in a really good report, but in light of all the negative things they've done, we don't necessarily notate that in their documentation. And what that creates is a situation where, one, the documentation starts to look like we're nitpicking. 1 minute late to work is nitpicking. 1 minute late to break is nitpicking. Even if they've done it 60 times, it still looks like nitpicking. And when we have one employee has a file that's 3 inches thick compared to all of your other employees whose files are, 12 pages, it starts to look like targeted bullying, and that can be a problem. So it's something to keep in mind. And one thing I say with documentation is, what am I documenting on all my other employees? How am I handling all of my other employees? Anytime I want to take an action, I need to compare what I do with other employees. Even if somebody's really getting under your skin and they're very frustrating, we need to look at what would we do with our other employees. So, for example, if another employee in your department in a similar position with similar responsibilities was 1 minute late, is it worth a conversation? Would you say something to them? Try to find that balance in making sure that you're not over documenting one employee. If you would give an employee credit for something, make sure that you would give another employee credit for it as well, so that you have a really balanced approach and not letting the fact that somebody's a difficult employee encourage us to over document or always and never their documentation, so that we are creating a situation where we may be accused of targeting, nitpicking, or going after an employee, because that can really backfire on you as well. So the one thing that I want to go over with on resumes, this happens especially a lot on resumes, is secret codes and marks. This can happen on other documents, sometimes on things like FMLA documents or ADA documents and paperwork, doctor's notes, but it particularly seems to happen a lot on resumes and applications, and that is secret codes and marks. This is where we are, I guess, afraid maybe that we're going to forget some information, or we'll not recall something later on. And so we make little tick marks or secret codes or marks or something to remind us of information later. And it ends up biting us after the fact. So for example, so I made up this resume and I made these marks just to be clear on how I got there. But so for example, I put this AA up in the top corner. What does that mean? So after the fact, an attorney would have a heyday with this. What does an AA mean? You know, does it mean All-American? Does it mean African American? Does it mean Asian American? Does it mean Alcoholics Anonymous? It could mean anything at all, and it could be totally discriminatory, or it could be, you know, one of a dozen things. It could absolutely sink my ship if it happened to be true, or it could be true, and that could be a real problem. If I put these little plus marks by a particular skill, that can backfire on me. If I have this little tiny hash mark up here by you know, somebody's address, you know, am I saying it's negative that this person lived in New Jersey? That could indicate some sort of bias, that could be a problem. You know, unfortunately, these types of things can really be a smoking gun for a discrimination case. So it's really critical. I absolutely advise people do not write on resumes. Never, ever write on resumes. Previously, when I worked at a company, I went in, one of my first jobs as HR, I went in and I did an audit of applications, and I went through the files and audited the application file, and I went in and there were several applications that somebody had taken a big blue highlighter and wrote in, you know, 8-inch tall letters no across certain applications for certain positions that just happen to be women. And that's a huge problem. And those are things that can really get you in a lot of trouble and just absolutely cannot happen. Now, maybe they wrote no on those applications because the person did not have the skills necessary, or maybe they wrote them on there because the person did something in the interview that was wildly inappropriate, that made them unqualified for valid reasons. But when you do things like that, the court will never assume that that's why. They're going to assume that it was for bad, nefarious reasons. And so that just cannot happen. So you need to make very certain that these types of little ticks and marks and things do not happen on applications, resumes, FMLA documentation, doctor's notes, those sorts of things, because it can really get you in hot water later on. Hints of discrimination. These are little word choices sometimes that happen on reviews and other types of employee documentation that can seem like just general statements, but can really be a big problem depending on the situation and the individual employee. So not a team player doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But if it says not a team player and it's on a review for the only African American employee in a department, that's an entirely different message, and that can be a problem. That's why it's very important to stick to the facts. Not a team player is an opinion and is not a fact, and it can get you into hot water. So instead of saying not a team player, it would be much better and highly recommended to state the facts. The employee refused to participate in the project. The employee missed a deadline. Those types of things are much better than not a team player. Doesn't fit in here. This one is a little more obvious, but is much worse when it is a person who has a protected class. So if you have an employee who has a ADA accommodation and this type of statement is made on their review, this could be a huge problem. Doesn't fit the culture, has a bad attitude. It's much better to stick to the facts, write things that are behaviorally related. So the employee is unable to meet the deadline. The employee does not have the appropriate skills. The employee didn't complete a task on time. Those types of things that speak to the skills, adaptability, cooperation with coworkers are much better on reviews or disciplinary action or even in coaching than these types of statements that can get you into hot water later on. So wrapping up the details. So I want to talk about things that we can put in documentation, since we've just talked about all the things that shouldn't be in documentation, that will help us avoid problems and that will give you a little bit better structure to things that we do document regarding employee conversations. So templates. I love templates. I strongly recommend templates. They can really help your organization and just you individually have consistency. You're much less likely to be accused of treating employees differently if we use templates. So we're having the same structure of conversation with each employee each time. Really helps. Within your organization, if everybody's using the same format, it really helps to have that consistency. They prevent us from having omissions. So if you have a template that has an employee signature line, you are much less likely to miss having your employee sign the document. That can really help you out in the long run. They create a culture of fairness. So if every employee has to sign their coaching document, then no one is complaining that they're being treated unfairly. Well, I didn't have to sign that, or you asked me to sign it, but my coworker didn't have to sign it. You don't have those types of complaints when you have a really consistent process. And when everybody's doing it, then it's not as big of a problem. It's not a problem. People aren't going to be worrying about whether or not they're treated fairly. They're much easier to train to. So when we sit down with our groups, we can train all of our supervisors or all of our leaders the same process, the same coaching, the same disciplinary action policy or process. It's much easier to get everybody on the same page. And I really like this because once you have somebody in your group or in your department, in your team that really understands your documents and your templates and they're able to do them, they're much more likely, and it's much easier for them to help each other peer-to-peer on how to do the documents, how to fill them out, and you have a much stronger organization as far as peer-to-peer support than if everybody's out there reinventing the wheel all the time and they spend a lot of time agonizing over how to do these documents, how to document employee interactions, rather than actually having the conversations. It's a lot easier to catch errors when you have templates because you'll see things, if the employee didn't sign it, you're going to catch that right away. Whereas if everybody's making their own forms and their own documents, it's much easier to miss those types of things. And I just think that when you have templates that are easy to use and available to everyone, supervisors and leaders are much more likely to document than not, because documentation, honestly, I think most people hate doing it. It's hard enough to have the conversations, and then having to document is something that gets pushed to the back burner. So the easier we can make it for our supervisors and leaders to document by pulling up a quick form, filling it out, filing it away, the more likely they are to document. And the easier those forms are to kind of hit those points, signatures, dates, times, that sort of thing, the more likely we are to have better and accurate documentation. So the more templates you can have and use for the main things that you need to do, I think the stronger your documentation will be. This is language I love to see in documentation. So anytime I'm reviewing documentation, there are some kind of key phrases and language that I like to see that I think makes documentation with your employees much stronger. And I think that this helps employees understand the seriousness of the interaction or the conversation. The employee has agreed to immediate and sustained improvement. So anytime we're talking about disciplinary action or performance improvement, I like to see some sort of statement that has very specifically the statement, the employee, insert the employee's name please, has agreed to immediate and sustained improvement. Immediate and sustained is really important because a lot of times when we're talking to the employee about a behavior, if they appreciate their job and they want to keep their job, they will immediately improve it. So if we say you got to quit being tardy all the time or you need to improve your attendance, they will immediately do it. The problem is within the next 2 or 3 weeks, they kind of drift back to their old behaviors and they start being tardy again, or they start missing work, or they start being snippy with another employer, they start using their cell phone again. Whatever that behavior is we're trying to correct, they start drifting back. And that's always the problem. It's not necessarily getting them to be better, it's getting them to stay better. And so I like the sustained part because I want my employee to have that understanding that not only must you do better, but you must stay better. And so getting them to understand that and having them see that statement on their performance improvement plan or their SMART plan or their disciplinary action lets them know that the expectation is not just to change the behavior, but to sustain that improvement. The employee understands that any further incident will result in further disciplinary action up to and including termination of employment. I like this statement because I want the employee to understand that I expect sustained improvement, and if this continues to be a problem, the process will escalate. I don't like statements that say you will be fired because as a leader in the organization, as a manager, as a supervisor, I want the flexibility to not fire someone. I want to always be able to consider record, reason, and circumstance, and I want you to have that flexibility as well. However, the employee does need to understand that a termination of employment is a possibility if they continue on the path they're on. If they don't choose to correct the behavior, that they could be terminated. I think it is fair to let them know that, and we want to make sure that they understand the seriousness of the conversation. There's no point in having a conversation with an employee to change their behavior if we're not serious about it, and they need to understand that it is serious and it is important. So this little bit to let them know that something else is going to happen and that will be further disciplinary action. We're not going to keep having the same slap on the hand going forward, and is a good statement to have in each piece of their documentation. The employee understands that this behavior negatively impacts whatever it is. For all forms of documentation, it is really important that we include some statement of the negative impact to the business or to the organization. If an employee commits a behavior in your organization, but it has no negative impact to your organization, then really we're just complaining. So for example, if your employee is snapping their gum all the time and that just annoys you, that's really not negatively impacting your business and probably something we should not be taking disciplinary action over. That's just an annoyance, it's just a petty grievance. It's really not something that we should be taking disciplinary action over. So we want to make sure that we always include that impact. When we're talking about defending our action, there needs to be an impact, and we need to make sure that our employee understands what that impact is. So we want to notate that. The employee has been retrained on and have an attachment. So one of the things, and this seems to be most prevalent, at least in my history with unemployment claims, is when I terminate employment for somebody, unemployment frequently asks, did the employee understand that the behavior was unacceptable, and did they understand what the expected behavior was? So it's really good to have that documentation that, yes, the employee understood what was expected and they were trained on it. So I like to always have that piece of training documentation that says they were trained on how to do this, or they knew what the expectation was. So for example, if an employee was a no-call, no-show, it seems like common sense. They know they're supposed to call out when they don't, are going to be absent from work, unplanned. But I like to be able to demonstrate that by showing, okay, here's a copy of the policy. I've attached that. I had a conversation with them. I documented, I showed them the policy. I retrained them on the expectations. I gave them the call out number, and attached that. So anytime you have a situation like that, if you can attach the appropriate policy to that conversation and make sure that your employee, of course, has signed and dated it, that they're aware of that, that's always nice to have, and to demonstrate that, yes, you did tell them, you gave them an opportunity to correct that, you explained it to them again. Really good, solid documentation to have. So, ingredients for good documentation. Always make sure that we have the names. Please make sure they are the right names, first and last. Make sure that you have names of the employee, and of course, first and last names of the supervisors. These change over time. Dates and times of the conversation. Times are not always super important unless you have shifts or things like that. We want to make sure that we capture those correctly. Always include the situation and the setting. So when we're talking to our employees about something specific, if it's a disciplinary action, I like to include the situation or the setting. So if your employee returns from work and you think they have had alcohol and they are behaving a certain way, you want to make sure and include that they were returning from lunch and what that setting was, what office, that sort of thing, so that we have the best picture possible. Behavior and examples. Be specific. Use examples. Trying to make sure that your examples stick to the facts. When was the report due? What was the error? That type of thing. Try to keep opinions out of it. State the impact. So what is the impact to coworkers or the impact to the organization? Document any commitments that the employee makes. So even if it's a basic coaching conversation or disciplinary action or performance improvement, any of those, any sort of commitments that are made, we want to make sure that those are documented, whether that's an employee's commitment to the organization to change a behavior, learn the skill, whatever that is, we want to document that. Or if we make a commitment to our employee to provide a training or a mentor or anything of that sort, we want to make sure that we have those commitments documented and dates. If we are committing to do something by a date, or they are, make sure we have that. And then of course, consequences. So if there's any consequences for not completing something or for committing a behavior again, so if you're tardy again, we want to have those consequences documented as well. So if we have to take some sort of additional corrective action in the future, that we've documented what those consequences would be and what those timelines are. And then of course, signatures. I know that signatures are not required on all documents. I prefer that we sign as many as possible, because just having that acknowledgement that the conversation happened or that disciplinary action took place, I think is absolutely critical. The more times that we have that two-way conversation and that two-way acknowledgement, the more solid our documentation is. And then critical review. I think this is a great time to get your HR department involved or your management team involved, is at the critical review. So anytime you put together documentation, it's great to have your HR team review it. And if you're new to your role, having your HR team take a look at your coaching documentation, your performance review, your reviews, disciplinary action, before you give it to the employee is great. It's a good time to sit down side by side and have them look it over, and just make sure that if somebody from the outside looked at your documentation, make sure that it explains it and it's clear to outsiders, that it sticks to the facts, that it has clear references to any past incidents, and that you anticipate any criticism. So what could somebody say about this? How would they question it? What would they be looking at? and then just double check that all the details are accurate. So you want to make sure and kind of do this kind of critical review. How would somebody from the outside look at it? What would they be seeing in your documentation? So we want to do that before we give it to the employee and we get those signatures on it, because after signatures are on it, we should not be editing. So that wraps this up. This is my contact information. So if you have any questions or there's anything that I can answer for you or something you want to discuss or some detail I can clarify for you, please feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. This is our website address. I'm happy to answer questions or explain anything else I can for you. I really appreciate you taking time to attend this presentation on documentation. And here's some more training information if you are interested. Thank you so much.